They thought it was going to be another easy night, jokes, applause, that signature Denzel charm that could make even a serious moment feel light. The theater was packed, cameras flashing, the crowd buzzing with anticipation. Denzel walked onto the stage with a calm confidence, that unshakable stride that said he didn't come to entertain, he came to deliver. The host cracked a joke, the audience roared, and Denzel smiled, but not the usual warm, inviting smile. It was tighter, measured, like a man about to open a wound that everyone had been ignoring. He waited for the noise to die down. Then, his voice, deep and steady, filled the room. "Everyone wants to lead," he said. "But nobody wants to serve." The room froze. The laughter stopped mid-breath. A few nervous chuckles hung in the air, but Denzel didn't flinch. His tone cut through the glitter and the ego that usually draped Hollywood like perfume. "You call yourself a leader because people follow you on social media? That's not leadership, that's popularity. And popularity dies the moment the crowd finds someone shinier." A hush fell. The camera zoomed in on his face, still, sharp, uncompromising. It wasn't the speech they expected. It was a challenge. "Real leaders," he continued, "aren't the loudest in the room. They're the ones who make space for others to rise." The silence in that hall was deafening, the kind of silence that means people aren't just listening, they're rethinking everything. For a few long seconds, no one dared to breathe. Denzel stood under the soft golden stage light, his face half in shadow, eyes piercing through the crowd. It wasn't acting. It wasn't performance. It was conviction. And conviction, when spoken aloud by someone who's lived it, hits harder than any script. "Leadership isn't about control," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "It's about responsibility. It's carrying the weight when no one else will. It's doing the right thing when no one's watching." He walked across the stage, his hands clasped behind his back, the way a general might move before addressing his soldiers. "People laugh," he continued, glancing at the first row. "They think leadership is about being in front. But the best leaders are the ones who push from behind, who make sure no one's left behind." A murmur rippled through the audience, quiet, uncomfortable, the kind that comes when truth brushes against denial. Someone in the back whispered, "Man, he's not wrong." Denzel's eyes softened. "I've met people in this industry who call themselves kings, but treat others like servants. They think their status makes them great. But greatness doesn't come from status, it comes from sacrifice." He paused, letting the weight of that word hang in the air. "If you want to know what kind of leader you are, look at who's standing beside you when the lights go off. If it's just you and your ego, you've already failed." By now, the laughter that had filled the room at the start felt like it had happened hours ago. The crowd wasn't watching a celebrity anymore, they were witnessing a man strip down the illusion of power in real time. "Leadership," he said, almost whispering now, "starts with humility. And ends with legacy." The audience, once so loud, now sat in still reverence. Some looked away. Others nodded slowly. And Denzel, calm, unwavering, knew he had just changed the tone of the night forever. The room had gone from electric to eerily still, as if every camera and every eye had been locked into the same moment of reckoning. Denzel stood at center stage, his presence commanding but not loud. It was the quiet force of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. His next words were softer, but they carried the gravity of experience, the sound of someone who had seen too much and learned even more. "You see, leadership ain't about being perfect," he said, his eyes scanning the rows of polished faces. "It's about owning your flaws, and learning from them. The best leaders aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who fall, hard, and still get back up with their hands out, helping others rise too." He took a slow breath. "I've failed. I've disappointed people. I've walked through storms I brought on myself. But every time I stood up, I made sure someone else didn't have to fall the same way." There was no applause, no laughter. Just silence and a faint hum of emotion rising through the crowd. Even the production crew, usually busy checking angles and light levels, stood motionless. "We've confused charisma with character," Denzel continued. "A leader's job isn't to make you feel good, it's to make you better. And sometimes, that means being the person no one likes in the moment." He leaned forward slightly, as though confiding in each person individually. "If everyone agrees with you all the time, you're not leading, you're performing. Leadership isn't a spotlight. It's a cross you choose to carry, every day." A faint echo of his own words bounced off the theater walls. Some in the audience began to tear up. Not because it was sentimental, but because they recognized themselves in what he said. The assistants, the interns, the dreamers in the cheap seats, all suddenly understood why his words mattered. Denzel stepped back, his hand brushing his jacket as if to anchor himself in the moment. "We laugh at wisdom until we realize it's about us," he said quietly. "And by then, it's too late to pretend we didn't hear it." The crowd, humbled, reflective, sat frozen between guilt and admiration. The light seemed softer now, warmer, as if the room itself had surrendered to the weight of what Denzel was saying. You could hear the faint hum of the cameras, the quiet shuffle of someone wiping away a tear, the heavy breathing of 1,000 people realizing that this wasn't entertainment anymore. It was a mirror. "The problem today," Denzel said, his voice lowering to a slow, deliberate rhythm, "is that too many people want to be admired, not accountable." He let that hang. Every syllable hit with the precision of a hammer striking truth into concrete. They want applause, not correction. They want titles, not purpose. They want to be followed, but they don't want to be worthy of being followed. The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't just about Hollywood or politics. It was about every boardroom, every pulpit, every screen lit up with fake smiles and filtered values. Denzel wasn't just talking to them, he was talking to the entire country. "Everyone wants to be in charge," he said. "But leadership is lonely. It's dirty. It's thankless. And if you're doing it right, it's painful." A few gasps echoed from the crowd. Denzel's voice softened again, almost like a confession. "You ever notice how the greatest leaders in history, real ones, never called themselves great? Because greatness isn't a declaration. It's a debt. You owe it to the people you lead to give them everything, your time, your truth, your courage, even when it costs you your peace." The camera zoomed in slightly. His face, lined, focused, honest, filled the screen. No teleprompter. No script. Just truth. "You can't fake service," he said, tapping his chest. "People can feel your heart, even through a lie. And if you lead with pride instead of purpose, they'll follow you. But only to your failure." He looked up, eyes narrowing, as if challenging the unseen leaders watching from home. Leadership isn't about standing above people. It's about standing between them and the storm. The crowd exhaled, not in applause, but in awe. It wasn't a speech anymore. It was scripture. There was something sacred about the silence that followed. No coughs, no murmurs, just the collective stillness of a crowd realizing they were witnessing something that would outlive the night. Denzel's voice returned, steady and unhurried, but with a subtle fire building beneath the calm. "See, leadership isn't just about power," he said, eyes flicking between faces in the front row. "It's about pressure. The kind that either breaks you, or forges you." He took a slow step forward, and the stage lights caught the silver in his hair. Pressure exposes what's real. When everything's falling apart, when people turn on you, when you're alone with your thoughts, that's when your true character stands up, or disappears. He paused, letting the crowd breathe it in. "I've met people who crumble under truth. They hide behind excuses, behind money, behind fame. But if you want to lead, if you really want to change something, you have to let the fire burn away everything fake about you." The audience felt those words like heat. It wasn't just a metaphor anymore, it was a reckoning. Denzel's tone sharpened. The problem with our world isn't lack of talent or ideas. It's lack of courage. Everyone wants to talk. No one wants to stand. And if you're not willing to stand for something, the world will make sure you fall for everything. A ripple of murmurs filled the air. People were no longer just listening, they were confronting themselves. Some of you sitting here, he said, his gaze piercing the rows of executives and influencers, have more followers than purpose. You post about change, but you're too scared to lose comfort for it. The tension was palpable now. Denzel wasn't scolding them, he was freeing them, breaking through the armor of self-importance that success had built around them. You can build a brand, he said, but what about a backbone? You can build a platform, but can you build people? Because that's what leadership is. It's not about your name being remembered. It's about lives being better because you were here. He stopped, the spotlight catching the faintest glint of sweat on his forehead. Pressure, he whispered, isn't your enemy. It's the test that reveals who you really are. And with that, the fire beneath his words roared into meaning. The energy inside the auditorium had shifted. It was no longer an audience, it was a battleground of thoughts and emotions. The cameras were rolling, but even the cameramen had forgotten their jobs, every lens seemed to tremble slightly, following Denzel as if he were gravity itself. He took another slow step forward, his hand raised slightly, as though he were conducting an invisible orchestra. You know what's funny? He asked, his tone dipping into irony. Everybody wants to talk about change, until it's their comfort that has to change. The words hit hard. He didn't smile, didn't soften the blow. We tweet about justice from designer phones. We march for peace but can't stand the person next to us. We wear words like truth and honor on our shirts but can't carry them in our hearts. The crowd's faces were frozen in a strange mix of guilt and admiration. Denzel wasn't preaching, he was exposing. You want to know what real leadership is, he said, voice rising slightly. It's telling the truth when it's dangerous. It's loving people who don't agree with you. It's showing up, not when it's popular, but when it's painful. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the audience like a spotlight. The easy thing is to lead when everything's going right. The hard thing, the real thing, is leading when you're bleeding. When you're misunderstood. When the crowd that cheered you yesterday boos you today. He let the silence breathe before continuing. Everybody says they want to change the world, he said softly. But do you want to change yourself first? Because if your ego's in charge, your vision is blind. That last line rippled through the audience like a cold wind. Phones were forgotten. Notes were abandoned. This wasn't a lecture, it was a call to arms. I'm not talking about titles, Denzel said, his tone deepening. I'm talking about integrity. The kind you keep when no one's clapping. When no one's watching. That's where leadership begins, not under lights, but in the dark. He took a long breath, his voice now barely above a whisper but more powerful than ever. So I'll ask you this, he said, pointing toward the crowd. When the moment comes, and it will come, will you stand up for what's right, or will you stay seated for what's safe? A wave of tension spread through the audience, that haunting kind of quiet that comes right before the storm. The challenge had been issued. And no one in that room would leave the same. The next morning, the world woke up to the echo of his words. Clips of Denzel's speech had flooded every corner of the internet, timelines, talk shows, podcasts, classrooms. His question, will you stand for what's right, or stay seated for what's safe? Had become more than a line, it was a challenge to the conscience of a country. News anchors called it, the speech that shook leadership. Memes mixed with quotes, sound bites with essays. But underneath the noise, something real was happening, people were listening. People who hadn't cared about leadership, who'd been drowning in apathy and distractions, suddenly felt something they hadn't felt in a long time, accountability. On screen, Denzel's calm face replayed on loop, his voice echoing through living rooms and offices. You can't fake service. People can feel your heart even through a lie. The sentence had become a war cry in boardrooms. Young activists spray-painted it on walls. Teachers wrote it across classroom boards. Soldiers quoted it in mess halls. The internet was buzzing, but not with gossip, with reflection. By noon, political commentators had begun arguing about what Denzel meant. Some called it a message to the powerful. Others said it was a sermon for everyone. But the truth was simpler, and heavier. He had aimed his words not at a group, but through one. He wasn't just exposing corruption in leadership, he was calling out the moral laziness that allowed it to survive. The real enemy of truth, he'd said, isn't the liar, it's the listener who lets the lie live. That line became the headline. Billboards went up with it. A journalist called it the most uncomfortable truth of the decade. Even leaders who had ignored him before were now being asked about it in interviews, forced to squirm, stammer, or fake agreement. Denzel stayed silent. He didn't tweet, didn't post, didn't do interviews. The silence only made his words louder. The media wanted controversy, but what they got was conviction. Days later, footage emerged of students organizing rallies called "Stand Up or Stay Seated." Churches, non-profits, even corporations were hosting leadership nights based on the talk. It wasn't about politics anymore, it was about principle. He didn't give us a speech, one woman said on live TV, he handed us a mirror. And for the first time in years, the reflection America saw was honest. The world outside that auditorium was now roaring with conversation. But in one quiet corner of Los Angeles, Denzel Washington sat with his coffee, watching the chaos unfold on the screen, his own face, his own words, dissected by analysts and opportunists alike. A cultural reset, one commentator called it. A political statement, another claimed. But Denzel smiled faintly. It was never meant to be either. He leaned back, his voice calm as he later addressed a small group of young journalists who'd been invited for an intimate Q&A. You see, I didn't say what I said to trend, he began. I said it because silence had gotten too comfortable. People confuse calm with complacency. They forget that truth doesn't always shout, sometimes it whispers, and that whisper can shake the walls. One of the reporters asked whether he'd expected the speech to go viral. Denzel chuckled softly. You can't predict what honesty will do in a dishonest world, he said. But you can bet it'll make people nervous. He set the cup down and leaned forward, eyes steady. Leadership isn't about giving answers. It's about forcing the right questions to surface. If what I said made people uncomfortable, good. That means they heard me. By evening, clips of this conversation became the second wave of virality. The first had been outrage, this one was reflection. Across the country, schools were using his talk in ethics classes. Military academies cited his words in training programs. Even CEOs started quoting him in boardrooms, though not all of them understood the weight of the words they were using. Integrity, Denzel said, isn't just about what you do when people are watching. It's about what you refuse to do, even when no one would know. The camera zoomed in slightly, catching that familiar calm, steady conviction in his eyes. And that's why I'm not apologizing for a single word. Not one. The interviewer hesitated. So what comes next? Denzel smiled. I don't know. But maybe that's the beauty of it. When truth hits the air, you don't control where it travels, only that it does. That clip would become the defining moment, the quiet after the storm that proved something profound. Sometimes, leadership doesn't roar. It simply refuses to back down. By the end of that week, what had started as a simple Q&A had evolved into something no one could have scripted. It wasn't about Denzel anymore, it was about the echo he'd created. Across cities, young people began gathering in open spaces, holding homemade signs that read, "Stand for what's right," and "Integrity has no off days." Colleges organized spontaneous Denzel dialogues, where students and professors discussed what leadership should look like in the 21st century. Veterans wrote open letters describing how his speech reminded them of forgotten values. Even churches and community centers, divided by ideology for years, found a strange common ground in his words. Social media exploded again, but this time the noise wasn't toxic, it was transformative. Hashtags like #RealLeadership and #DenzelEffect started trending. A single line from his talk, "You can't fake service," became the slogan of a generation tired of shallow virtue signaling. In one viral video, a group of high school students stood in front of their local courthouse, reading his words aloud. Everybody wants to change the world, but nobody wants to change themselves. The crowd cheered. Their voices cracked with emotion, but they were steady, confident. Something had shifted. News channels began calling it the integrity movement. Late-night hosts joked about it, pundits debated it, politicians tried to co-opt it. But beneath the politics, the truth of it kept spreading like wildfire. People were ready to be better, or at least to start trying. Denzel watched quietly, saying little. When a reporter finally caught him outside a charity event and asked if he felt like he'd started a revolution, he paused for a long moment. "No," he said. "I think I just reminded people that their hearts were still working." That quote broke the internet again. It wasn't grand or self-serving. It was humble, the kind of humility that hits harder than arrogance ever could. Then came the marches, peaceful, candlelit, filled with ordinary people. Students, nurses, construction workers, retirees. They weren't demanding a policy. They were demanding principle. Placards bore one phrase, glowing against the night sky. "Truth doesn't need permission to speak." The camera panned across faces, hopeful, angry, awakened. And somewhere, miles away, Denzel watched it all unfold, knowing the world had finally remembered something sacred. Change doesn't start from power, it starts from courage. The months that followed felt like a cultural aftershock. The headlines had faded, but the movement had not. Across America, people still carried Denzel's words like a quiet anthem in their hearts. Offices began holding integrity hours, classrooms displayed his quotes, and even government officials, the ones who once dismissed him, began referencing his message in speeches. It wasn't performative anymore. It was personal. And yet, Denzel stayed away from cameras. No grand tour, no press circuit. Just quiet consistency, teaching, donating, mentoring. Until one evening, months later, he appeared at a youth summit in Atlanta, standing before a crowd of young dreamers who had grown up in the world his words had shaken. The lights dimmed, the room went silent, and he began his final reflection. "You've all heard enough speeches. You've seen enough leaders tell you what to believe. But leadership isn't a speech, it's a sacrifice. It's what you give when the cameras turn off, when no one is clapping." He looked over the crowd, eyes soft but steady. "I didn't start this to make noise. I spoke because I was tired of the silence. We've gotten too used to leaders who sell comfort instead of truth. But comfort never built a nation, conviction did." The audience sat frozen. You could hear the air itself listening. He took a slow breath, voice deepening with gravity. "Don't just admire honesty, practice it. Don't wait for permission to do what's right. The world doesn't change because of speeches. It changes because someone decides to live differently the day after." Then came the line that would be remembered forever, the one that transformed a message into a movement. "If your truth doesn't make you uncomfortable, it's not truth, it's marketing." A murmur rippled through the crowd, then applause, then thunder. Cameras flashed, not for fame, but for memory, to capture the moment a generation reclaimed its voice. When the applause finally died down, Denzel smiled. "Don't follow me," he said. Follow the part of yourself that still believes in something pure. That's where real leadership begins. The lights faded to black. In the days that followed, the clip went viral again, not as entertainment, but as testimony. Commentators called it the closing of the circle. Churches played it during sermons. Teachers turned it into lessons. A journalist wrote, "He didn't build a movement, he reminded us we already had one." And as the video reached millions, one line lingered in every listener's mind, the echo of a man who spoke truth when the world had forgotten how. Leadership isn't about being followed. It's about being remembered for the courage to stand alone. The screen fades from black, soft piano chords rise beneath a low hum of applause. Denzel's silhouette appears, standing tall, calm, timeless. Narrator, voiceover. They laughed until he spoke. They doubted until he stood. In a world addicted to noise, one man's silence became thunder. A montage plays, flashes of his speech, students chanting his words, candlelit marches, and faces lit by conviction. He didn't demand attention, he earned it. Not through power, but through truth. Denzel Washington reminded us that leadership isn't about applause, it's about accountability. Clips of crowds chanting fade into quiet scenes, a teacher writing integrity on a chalkboard, a veteran placing a hand over his heart, a young girl whispering his quote. If your truth doesn't make you uncomfortable, it's not truth. History will remember the ones who dared to speak when silence was easier. And maybe, that's what real leadership is, not standing above others, but standing for them. The music swells. A slow zoom on Denzel's calm expression. The echo hasn't stopped. It lives in every act of courage, every word of truth, every choice made when no one's watching. Because some voices don't fade, they evolve. And this was more than a moment. It was a message. The screen fades to black. One final phrase appears. They laughed until Denzel said this, then the world started listening.